This is co-chaired by Dr. Jatindra Bhalla from Delhi, Dr. Harshul Tak, and Dr. Varthaman Kankaria. So
Thank you, sir.
I will take the opportunity to heartily welcome Dr. Steve Arshinoff, who has very generously accepted our invitation to take his time out and come this early and give his presentation for our state meeting.
So I'm going to talk to you about OVDs. You just heard about with George about how to remove something carefully. People often have trouble with OVDs, not because they don't do things well, but because they don't often look at them in a way that's critical before you choose to use something. And so I just chose this Proposition 26, like doing geometry in school, where you have endless decisions to make about how to approach something. And I'm going to tell you about a problem that came up and the background and give you an idea of how I think we should think about dealing with OVDs. So the purpose of this talk is not to promote any specific OVD, but to give you an example of how to think about choosing the best OVD for a certain problem that you might have to approach. And I'm going to talk about femto capsulotomy tear-outs. Now, that has been an issue since femtos first came on the market, and there was a committee of the ASCRS which talked about the fact that initially femto capsulotomy tear-outs of the anterior capsule were 10%, and they decreased over the first few years. They were saying to 1% in 2013, but then 2 years later, another paper came out and said they were getting 8.3 times the number of tear-outs in their 4,000 cases in femto cases compared to phaco cases. So that's still not very good. So you have to expect that when you do femtos, you have to watch the anterior capsulotomy carefully. So the problem is that people often do things wrong. This is not to criticize Uday Devgan, but I'll just show you something that he teaches, and I'll show you where it's actually wrong.
We have an incomplete femtosecond laser capsulotomy. And you can see there's that danger zone where it didn't go through. Now we've done the Rexus with our femtosecond laser. Cataractcoach.com, we have an...
Okay, sorry. But anyway, it didn't work very well. So I'll tell you what he did wrong. He went and he filled the anterior chamber with vision blue right away. What that does is it decreases the pressure on the capsule in the anterior chamber, and those particular anterior capsules tend to tear out when you decrease the pressure. So let me show you how to approach those. And first I want to tell you that how to look at something. When you look at your cataract surgery, my personal belief is that every complication that I've seen in somehow either not noticing something, neglecting it, or changing something, I've caused the problem. And when you set up an anterior chamber for surgery, you can only change the modulations of your machine, or you can change the rheology of the chamber by changing your OVD and how you use it. Other than that, you're basically stuck. So you have to learn how to do these things well to decrease your number of problems. So we had multiple types of OVDs in the world, and I know we all try to use what's available, what's cheaper, what's easier to get, but sometimes you have to consider what all the possibilities are and try to choose the best one for a specific case, because the complication, of course, is much worse than just buying another OVD. So I often show this. I like the music, but I want people to understand that the original purpose of OVDs was to push back the iris and vitreous to implant an anterior chamber or an iris-supported chamber lens after doing intercapsular surgery. And so the first reason why we used OVDs was to induce stability and pressure in the eye. So you have to remember that we all do our surgeries under different styles of pressure. And it's important to understand how much pressure you want to induce in an eye and where you want it to be able to do your surgery well. And we're all different kinds of surgeons. Some people, like me, for example, like to use Helan GV or Helan 5. And those of us are relatively high pressure surgeons. We like to have the eye very stable and pressurized. And some people do lower pressure surgery. They like to use Helan or Visco, which induce much less pressure than Helan GV or Helan 5. And they like to do their surgery. And they've designed their surgical techniques to adapt to that lower pressure. And some people, like in lots of India and sub-Saharan Africa, use HPMC, which is really very low pressure surgery. And when I watch surgery from those areas, I notice the very ingenious ways people have managed to figure things out so they can either work in lower pressure, or they can manage to increase the pressure by making a very small incision first and pressurizing the eye with HPMC, doing what they want, requiring high pressure initially, and then changing to the rest of their technique. So in these cases, what you have to do is learn how to look at them. So the question is, what is the problem with respect to physics that we're trying to deal with in this kind of a case? And if you look at it, the problem simply is that the laser has put a lot of gas into the capsule, and the gas tends to tear the capsule outwards by increasing pressure in the bag. Okay, fair enough. So then how do we want to deal with a problem like that? Well, if you look at the physics of what we've done, you can only overcome the problem of increased pressure on one side of a membrane by increasing the pressure on the other side of the membrane. Because you know that in the atmosphere, the pressure actually is quite high, but we don't care because it's all around us. So if you increase the pressure in front of the capsule, you'll offset the capsule pressure behind it, and it'll stabilize. So the next question you ask is, have we dealt with a similar problem before? Because if you have, that gives you a hint of how to deal with this one. And we have. We've dealt with Argentinian flag sign. And the issue with that is really, if you understand physics and OVDs, you should never really see Argentinian flag sign. And so the question is why? Well, we want to do, as I just said, what we call pressure-equalized cataract surgery, where the pressure in front of the lens is the same as that behind it. And if you think about cataract surgery, there's always pressure behind the lens because the muscles aren't paralyzed in our modern surgery. So we have an equal or opposite pressure going anteriorly from the other side of the sclera, and that pushes against the back of the lens. But in every case we do, the lens is relatively solid. When it's solid, a solid barrier will not transmit pressure from one side to the other, but a liquid will. And a mature cataract is basically a necrotic cataract and a necrotic anterior capsule. And so because it's a fluid, it will allow transmission through the cataract to the back of that lens capsule, and that's what makes it tear out. The fact that the capsule itself is not strong. And the capsule is convex anteriorly. So an anteriorly convex thing that you perforate with pressure behind it will tear out to the periphery. So if you place a viscous elastic OVD in front of it and you flatten it or make it concave, it will not tear out, it will only tear in. Okay, fair enough. So here's a case. And you can see as I inject OVD, I'm using Helon 5. I fill the chamber first, and then I just paint a little tiny bit of trypan blue across the capsule because the trypan blue cross-links the capsule at the same time as it stains it. And I use a needle because I don't want to open the incision and let the OVD escape. And that keeps the entire eye pressurized so the cortex stays in the capsule and you can just gently tear the capsule around. Okay. Every successful method that has been proposed so far to deal with Argentinian flag sign uses some variation of pressure-equalized cataract surgery to stabilize the capsule before creating the rhexis. No matter which technique you see someone promote, if you watch it carefully, you'll see that somehow they're balancing the pressure. So remember, that's what you actually want to do. So what does that tell us for the problem we're dealing with? Well, the truth is that flax is quite similar to a hypermature cataract, but in flax, we really have increased intercapsular pressure, whereas in a Argentinian flag sign, we have pressure behind the lens pushing forward. So they're not quite the same, but they're similar. All right, so then how should we deal with a capsulotomy created by a laser? Should we use a very high viscosity OVD like we do with Argentinian flag sign? Well, actually, not necessarily, because the eye is still closed when we start doing cataract surgery in a flax case. But we can use the thinner cannula because sometimes the capsule is forward and it's folded over sometimes. And so if you use a thinner cannula, you can get behind it either by going through the side port on the left or through the main incision on the right, and you can put the capsule back so it's flat and then make it depressed by increasing the pressure. And the best OVDs to use for this are either Helon or Helon GV because the incision is still closed, so you can induce a lot of pressure either with Helon or Helon GV, but they come with a thin-walled cannula, a 27 gauge, which is easier to get behind the space and to push the capsule backwards. And that's how you can do these cases. And here I'll show you two of them. This was one on the left-hand side it looks like there's only adhesion on the left here of the capsule, but you can see as I inject the Helon GV, that what's happening is the capsule looks like it's starting to separate. So maybe it wasn't really attached. It could be loosely attached or not attached at all. And when I go in with these forceps, which are Haldane-Perkar masket forceps and have tiny tips, so I'll show you those in a second, you can just pull it away by pushing posteriorly. It was Jim Gills who first told us that if we do capsulotomy by pushing posteriorly, the capsule will tend to tear inwards and not outwards. And so that works extremely well. Now here's another one on the right-hand side, which is worse. You can see that from the bottom half of the capsule here entirely is still attached. There are a few bubbles behind it, and because the bubbles haven't escaped, it tells you that probably it's still attached. And we go inside here with the forceps, you can see that as I push posteriorly and centrally, near where the capsulotomy should be, you can see that the bubbles are moving, and you can see that the capsule is actually tearing as I do that. But it tears inward, not outwards. So it prevents you from getting an extension of the capsular tear. And you take out the capsule and everything is fine. And you just saved yourself from having a problem. These are the Haldane-Perkar masket forceps. I don't get kickbacks, but they are very, very shallow. They have this nice hinge, so you can get them into a tiny space. And these little fine tips at the end allow you to push the capsule posteriorly and do the capsulotomy more easily. Okay, so then what happens if you do flax and you get a patient whose pupil doesn't dilate? Because that happens very often, that after applying the laser, the pupil gets smaller and smaller. So what you can do is, it was shown by Lundberg and Bendig that if you use xylocaine and phenylephrine, you in 20 seconds get excellent dilation of the pupil. So you can make up either this solution that I make, and you can inject it when you start surgery, first through the side port as anesthesia, and then after the OVD on top of the capsule, and you get much better dilation. You can make this stuff yourself, or, well, first you get these nice big pupils, or you can buy either Midrain in Europe, you can make your own xylocaine phenylephrine, you can get Phenacaine from Entod in India, or you can get Phenacaine Plus, which is sold in India. Phenacaine Plus is a copy of Midrain, and these are available all over the place. And what I do is I use these dilating solutions in every patient now because it makes surgery more easy, and especially in femto cases. So here's the problem. I was doing bilateral surgery on August 23rd, and I was doing the second eye of this patient. And as soon as I touched the foot pedal, within a tenth of a second, the patient jumped. And when the patient jumps, my catalyst turns off. What I was left with was an eye that looked like this. And I made a drawing because you really couldn't see it well in the video. And what you see here is a whole bunch of little dots, like a micro postage stamp attachment of the capsule to the exterior part of the capsule. So what's going to happen if I go and pull this capsulotomy, it's going to be like having a very ragged capsule and will probably tear. So how do you deal with this? So the question is to sit back before you go and do what I just told you, like you would do for a femto case, and think, what is this case actually most similar to, and how should I deal with it? And these are the choices. So what happens is, unlike a flax OVD usual case, in this case, I'm going to have to open the incision, and I'm going to have to go all around that flap and make sure it's free. And because the incision will be open, it isn't quite the same as the usual flax case when I can do the depression of the capsule without opening the incision. And there are no areas here of the flap being elevated, so I don't really care how big the cannula is. And there's no gas in the lens. So the anterior capsule really isn't being pushed forward. It's just a really poor, ragged capsulotomy. So in this case, it's more closely similar to wanting to do a Gilsian capsulorhexis in an Argentinian flag sign than it is in most other flax cases. So what I did here is I opened the incision, I injected Helon 5, depressed the capsule, and I went and started to do a capsulotomy, the same as I would do in a regular cataract case. But then when I got to the point over here where it started to be where the postage stamp capsulotomy was, I took my forceps and I depressed all the way around very gently, and then I tore the capsule towards the center manually, and it came out perfectly. So I did the same thing that I would do in an Argentinian flag sign, rather than what I would do in a routine femto case. So the point of all this is when you do surgery, and you encounter some kind of a problem, the same way that George said he was being careful in taking out his OVD because he recognized that before he started as a potential problem, sit back and think what the problem you're facing is most like. And when you think about that, you realize the criteria the basis of which you choose one OVD over another, and you either can choose, in this kind of a case with a intumescent lens or a capsulotomy, is it like an Argentinian flag sign or a barely started femto capsulotomy, and then you want to use Helon 5 and apply pressure? Or is it more like an incomplete femto when you have gas in the bag and you have outward pressure, and then you want to do a flax OVD press with Helon or Helon GV? And of course, every other situation we encounter in surgery also has specific applications of how you want to choose your OVD to stabilize the anterior chamber to allow you to do what you're trying to do safely and without problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. That was a new way to think about a problem which we often face. And Dr. Bhalla, Dr. Harshul, do you have questions on this, please?
Yeah, Dr. Meenu, can you hear me?
Yes, Harshul. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Arshinoff, it was great to hear you again. And
Stop your car first. You're driving.
I'm stuck in the traffic actually. It's
okay. Carry on.
I'm so sorry for that actually.
Yeah, that's what you should be safe driving. That's all.
Yeah. No, I've stopped. Yeah. So,
Okay.
Dr. Arshinoff, I want to know that what is the flow rate which you recommend if we use viscoadaptive OVD so that we get the advantages when we need it and when we want to wash it off? What is the flow rate? Because it's always said that low flow rate, high flow rate. So for beginners, I think it will be.
Okay. It's a very good question, Harshal. So the thing about viscoadaptives is they were designed to behave differently in different flow rates. And so suppose you have a very difficult case and you want to keep the OVD in place and maintain the stability in the high pressure of Helon 5, but you want to lower your flow rate for those cases. And actually you can go as low as 15, because if you keep the anterior chamber filled with OVD and you have a little small space in front of the capsulotomy where you have fluid, you end up working in an area that's only a third or so the size of the anterior chamber. And a flow rate of 15 gives you the same turbulence as if you had 45 in the whole eye. And you can do the case in the bag like that. And I do that often for IFIS cases. If they're bad IFIS cases, you just dilate with OVD and you go along with very low flow and it stays perfectly stable. But then when the case is finished, you increase your flow rate to 25 or 30, and then the OVD will break up because it's designed to break up when you have it above 25, and then it all comes out nice and neatly and the iris flops and it works very well. So you're right, changing the flow rate when you use viscoadaptives really allows you to get much better advantage of the viscoadaptive and using it for different things at the same time. It was designed to be an OVD where its properties change by changing flow rates.
You're muted, Harshul, you're muted.
Yeah, one more question, Dr. Arshinoff. Do you prefer using the dispersive and cohesive OVD in the same syringe, or you prefer using them in a different syringe and use them in a soft shell technique?
I like them in different syringes because then you can place each where you want it, not have to do it in the order that comes to the syringe. And I always prefer to use them in different syringes. It's fine to use it in one syringe if you're going to do every single case the same soft shell technique and exactly the same. But if you want to do variety, because suppose you have someone that has some broken zonules somewhere one day and the other person has something else and they're all a bit different, by having different syringes, you can maneuver the where you want. And many companies will try to sell you like the ideal average OVD for every case. But the problem is the regular cases aren't a problem. It's the unusual case that are a problem. And so you really always find you have much more ability to do things when you have each OVD in a different syringe and you use it how you want to. Especially those of us who get sent difficult cases.
So, Dr. Meenu, we are very fortunate now that many Indian companies are making very good, viscoelastics. Like cost was the biggest factor, Dr. Arshinoff, in India to use Helon 5 and all those. viscoelastics, but we have many companies who make very nice Viscoat and all those, viscoelastics. Dr. Meenu, are you using those viscoelastic like HyloView and all those which are made by Appa, different
In
companies?
South India, in South India also we make high molecular weight sodium hyaluronate and even a viscoat similar. So and even a higher concentration viscoat similar is also there. So I think they work well in most of the cases, and routinely I am using that now. So Dr. Balla, do you have any question to Dr. Arshinoff?
Yeah, Dr. Arshinoff, that was a very nice presentation. And like Harshul said, you decrease the flow rate also to, you advise to decrease the flow rate to 15. Otherwise, with higher flow rate, these viscoadaptive molecules will break up. Similarly, if you do you modulate your phaco energy also? Because the higher molecular weight viscoelastic, if you give higher energy, there are chances of wound burn with decreased flow rate. So will you like to do that, sir?
Well, that's a whole new lecture, but basically it goes like this. Yes, I always modulate my phaco power, and I actually custom set my phaco machine to my own design delivery of power, so that as it's always on pulse, and as I put my foot pedal down to increase the power, the spread of the pulses goes further and further apart. Because when you want high energy in a dense lens, if the pulses are very rapid, the lens chatters. So if you spread the pulses more, the lens doesn't chatter and comes back to the phaco tip. And you can set all of the modern phaco machines to do that, so that as your pedal goes down, the pulse separation becomes greater. And as long as you have pulse and some circulation of fluid, you can never burn an incision. And by having continuously variable pulse set up, which is what I call my setting, but you can get it anywhere, then what you do is, because when you increase the energy when it might burn the wound, by separating them, the amount of total energy put in is not higher, so you never burn the wound. And it's really not very complicated, and everybody can set their machines to do that. It actually works better, and it makes your phaco much easier.
So could you please, in a nutshell, for everybody is listening, could you please explain how this high molecular weight viscoelastics and wound burns are connected?
Well, actually, they're not. Wound burns were always reported.
That is what I want to make it clear.
Yeah.
So if people believe that using some kind of visco causes wound burn. So please clarify on.
Wound burns were first reported from visco when people went in and did phaco before clearing any space for circulation of BSS. And as soon as they began to circulate BSS before putting their foot to the floor in the phaco pedal, and when they began to use pulse, all the burns disappeared. It's the dispersive OVDs that tend to be diffused more and not in one mass that will usually cause wound burns. Wound burns are very, very rare if you use Helon 5 or any viscoadaptive, because it tends to stay as a mass and you have circulation of fluid beside it.
Can I ask one question,
Yes,
Dr. Meenu?
yes, Harshul, yes.
Dr. Arshinoff, don't you think that HPMC should be off the market now?
You want an honest answer?
Yeah.
Yes. I think you really have a much higher risk of problems with HPMC. I know, I'll say something without trying to be critical, all right? I fully understand that in many places, you have cataract camps in India, all kinds of things people try to save money. Every time you try to save money, you have a side effect that's undesirable. When I was last in India, just prior to the pandemic, I was at a couple of meetings, and one of the comments was that there seemed to be an epidemic of corneal decompensation in India. I'm certain it's because of the high use of HPMC in some places. Now, if you start to learn to use the more viscous, cohesive ones, like you now have made in South India in various places, you'll just find that everything goes better and smoother and you'll have less complications. HPMC was first made by Fechner in '76 in his basement in Germany. And the Germans and then some other countries, well, India, began to first make HPMC. The first company to manufacture it commercially was Shaw and Shaw in Calcutta. And they made it, I think, in '78 or '79. And they began to say that it was the same as Helon. And because it was inexpensive, it was used a lot in India and various places. But I think that, taking it off the market is a severe thing, because even Orcolon, which had a disaster everywhere in the world over 20 years ago, was withdrawn from most markets. But if you go to Brazil, you can still buy it. So, taking things off the market doesn't usually happen. People find ways to sell things, but I think that we should use it rarely. It still has a good use. If you want to put in a phakic lens, often HPMC can be the best OVD, because you don't need a lot of pressure. You can just slide it in gently, comes out easily without getting shaking of the lens. So taking off the market's a bit severe, but I think you don't really want to use it for your more severe cataract cases, or really for most cataract cases.
So I think there's a drastic statement that HPMC should be off the market. But then see, in early 2000s, when I went to Bolivia for a training program, they told me that my technique is costly or expensive, because there was another surgeon from Brazil doing Blumenthal technique, which did not use visco. So using HPMC as a visco itself was a expensive procedure for. So there is a role for HPMC still in the developing world, and where the cost factor definitely matters. But then it is the selection of what you use for a what particular case, and at what training stage you are, how good you are with what you're doing. That also will decide on what you will take. And one last question to Dr. Arshinoff. See, I had one femto in an intumescent cataract, and there was 1 or 2 attached areas, and I opened the incision and I stain all my femto cataracts flaps also with blue. I do it under air, and I put in air, and at that point it just broke. One edge of the rexus just extended to the periphery. So I could have prevented it if I had heard your lecture before, but then I later on realized the reasons, and then now it is okay. But then it happens in some cases like that. So listening to this is very important, is what I understand.
Okay, thank you. But your comment on the chamber maintainer is excellent, because I wasn't meaning to criticize India for using HPMC, because it first was made commercially in India. The comment on the chamber maintainer, which came from Blumenthal and from Israel, it is actually still a problem in Israel, because they've been taught to use chamber maintainers, and you get more cell loss because you're washing the endothelium with balanced salt throughout surgery, and it's very hard to convince them to change. And it's the same problem that you have with HPMC in India. When someone starts doing something, it's very hard to convince them that another way works better. But slowly, the world is realizing that the less flow of balanced salt you have against the endothelium, and the more you protect it, the better it's going to be in the long run for your patient. That's just the way it is. There are many things I've learned. I've learned a lot from India, because in Canada, it's funny that you have both George and I here, because Canada has 15 training programs in ophthalmology. India has 1,762. So when you guys come to us, I wonder, you can't find somebody in India? And I've learned a lot from all of my Indian colleagues, because you have so much experience and so many new ideas. It's fantastic. And I thank you for having me and for inviting me to take part.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steve Arshinoff. This was great having you. Thank you for sparing your time. I know you have an appointment right after this. And thank you, Dr. Balla, Dr. Harshul, Dr. Varthaman, for joining for this session. And we are closing this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meenu. Yeah.
Goodbye. I have to sign off and go to
Dr. Meenu. Thanks, Dr. Steve.
Thanks, Dr. Steve. Yeah.
Dr. Harshul, everyone. Dr. AB.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.